Today we are joined by Teagan Browne. Teagan, tell us why you're here and give us a little bit of insight into who you are.
Yeah, so I'm here because I met Colton and Kaylin freshman year of college, and I listened to their podcast, and I wanted to share my viewpoint and ask them some more questions about stuff they said in the podcast that I'd like to know more about their opinion on, and talk about my opinion and how it differs from theirs.
And for context, the podcast you're talking about, I presume, is the podcast we most recently did on gender and sexuality and also touched on race as well, right?
Yes, that is the podcast I'm talking about.
Perfect. Well, if you have any questions or criticisms, fire away and we'll do our best to explain our viewpoints and maybe have a successful dialogue.
Okay, sounds good. Kaylin, my first question is for you. So when I was listening to the podcast, a really big sticking point for me was when you said, as long as you know who you are in your mind, that's what matters in regards to LGBTQ people being misgendered or not getting their proper gender used, and especially on the topic of creating more genders to make everyone feel inclusive. So my question is, what do you say to, as I presume you are not a part of the LGBTQ community, as I believe you mentioned in the podcast. So you compared it to a lot of people go through criticisms being overweight people go through criticisms being overweight. You said you yourself face criticism of being lazy because you play video games all the time. But in my opinion, I think it's different for the LGBTQ community, because for them I've personally seen a lot more bullying in regards to gender and being LGBTQ. I've seen friends go through gender dysphoria in being transitioning genders, even though I try my hardest to call them by their proper name and proper genders. But even though I'm trying my best and the people around them are trying their best, the society as a whole still sees them as who they once were, and I've seen the negative impacts that it's had on them. So I guess what do you think about that? And do you think there's a difference in someone who's LGBTQ getting bullied for that and facing that criticism for being LGBTQ versus getting criticized for being lazy because you play video games or being overweight?
Okay, so that's a really good question, and I'm going to reiterate just to make sure that I understand your question fully and that I'm not missing any points or trying to, explain something that doesn't actually tackle what you're asking at the core. And so you're basically saying that I made a comparison between basically people who identify as part of the LGBTQ plus community and something that you're stating is different, which is like physical or perhaps how do I want to put this? You brought up my point about being lazy, right? And you're saying that these are actually two entirely different things.
Yeah, I'm saying that. Sorry.
No,
I'm
go ahead.
saying being LGBTQ is something you are born with and something you can't change. And I'm saying that being overweight is something you can work on, and I feel like you'll have a lot easier time convincing people you aren't lazy playing video games than getting acceptance for being LGBTQ, in my opinion and in my experience. But yeah, so I'm asking you about them being two different things.
So that's actually really interesting. I think I touched on this on a previous episode very briefly, or maybe Colton did, about things that you can't change. And now that I think about it, right, after being a little more educated, I'm not going to claim I'm very smart in understanding people who identify as part of those communities, clearly, because in the episode I was talking about hundreds of genders. That I don't think that's a realistic number. I probably sounded like a bigot there, but that's okay. That's interesting. So you're claiming that this is something that, and I think I would agree with that point, actually, that this is something that most people aren't in control of. if not all people who are in this community, right? And so they're in a problem that is really hard to solve, because it's not like being lazy where you can just get yourself together and stop being lazy, right? You're claiming this is something that you can't necessarily, this is a horrible term, but the right calls it fix, right? Like they think you should fix yourself, when this is part of your nature, I guess. Is that what you're claiming?
Yeah, that's what I'm claiming.
That's interesting. And this is backed by, you would say, experiences you've had in your life of talking to these people and hearing their stories. So I guess what I'm more curious about, if you could help elaborate on this point for me, is if you have experienced this, is how do they describe, if you've had this talk with anyone, how do they describe that feeling? I'm very curious about that, because I think for me, one of the hardest things to understand is perhaps what goes through someone's head and their experiences when they're part of a community that I've had very little experience with. I've hung around mostly straight people my whole life, who are part of the two, what's the word I'm looking for? The classic genders of male, female, right? I've never had that dialogue with people. And so I think one of the important things I've been lacking is that human experience of actually getting to know people who know what it's like to feel that certain way. And so when I say things like that on the podcast, I'm claiming them from my experiences. And so sadly enough, my experiences are a lack of knowing those types of people. So I think it'd be really helpful if you could elaborate to me, like, their story, of course, in a way that you think is respectable.
And as a clarifying point, I think to ask that succinctly in a way that I actually am curious about too, how is this sensation of, as you say, being either disrespected or bullied as someone who's not fitting into this community, how does that feel, in fact, different than if you were being disrespected for being overweight, for example?
Yeah, so I can't speak for people that have personally gone through this because I am cis, but I know a lot of transgender people. One of my best friends from home, I've been friends with him since we were 2.5, and he recently transitioned in high school, and so I've talked with him a lot about stuff like this, but I obviously can't speak entirely for that community. But from what him and I have talked about, he said it was like waking up in the wrong body and being in an out-of-body experience. He would go through life like a third person watching his own story, knowing like, this doesn't fit how I feel on the inside. It'd be like, imagine if you woke up in like a girl's body. That would be completely weird to you, to be having all these different functions and to be constantly told by society, hey, you are a girl, even though you know you're a guy. And sometimes it takes them a while to figure it out. And for my friend, it causes a lot of like depression and feeling like he was inadequate, even though he had me. And I tried my best to be as supportive as I could. His parents were extremely supportive. He had all that support from people that mattered the most, friends, family, but he lost a lot of friends when he came out as transgender. And he said it really showed him like who his true friends were, and that he thanked me for being there for him. But he really said, when you know how certain you are that you are something and everybody else tells you, no, you can't be that thing, you're this thing, it hurts to be told day in and day out by strangers who just look at you and make assumptions about your gender. And while you guys probably don't face it, and I don't either, I can imagine it would hurt. When I was younger, I was like 10 or 11, I had pretty short hair, and this was before puberty kicked in and like gave me features that make me look like a girl. Like, you can obviously look at me and be like, oh, she has boobs, she's a girl, but this was before that kicked in, and I would wear like t-shirts and shorts, and everyone called me a dude that didn't know me. Like subs would call me that because my name is gender neutral, Teagan. It's not inherently a girl's name. It's not inherently a guy's name. And, that hurt a little bit. But for my friend who saw me go through that, he said it was hundreds of times worse. And while I have a little bit, I will never know what it's like to be called that for, I think he transitioned when he was like 15. So that's 15 years of his life. He was called the wrong gender and the wrong name. And to my knowledge, that would hurt. That would really suck. And to be worried that you want to be your true self, but people might not like you anymore.
Interesting. I've never had it put. Maybe I have heard it put in a similar fashion the way you stated it. But that might go to show that maybe I wasn't paying really good attention to whatever YouTube video I was watching or discussion I was reading. So I'm grateful that you brought up the kind of the analogy of having this third person perspective on your body. Makes it at least a lot easier for me to visualize. I got to be honest with you, Teagan. I don't think I know enough to fully debate your claim that it really is different than the other things I talked about, like weight and being lazy. However, I can definitely see with a lot more, I guess, empathy for people's situations. I'm glad you brought up that way of looking at it. I'm gonna have to let that one simmer for a while.
Yeah. No worries. I appreciate you saying when you don't know something, when you don't have enough information, because I agree with you guys. Truth is important, and it's important to portray truth across the media because, like you guys said, that's lacking nowadays, and I agree with you guys on that point. So I wanted to make sure I talk about there are things I agree with you guys on, but there are things I do disagree with you guys on the podcast. But yeah.
And that's really the point. This is a pursuit of truth, and I'm glad you brought that up because we as individuals, let alone as people listening to this podcast, can never truly find those answers unless there's dialogue, and sometimes that dialogue requires disagreement. So thank you for coming on, and feel free to ask your next question.
I guess my closing remarks with that back and forth in particular is, I think my next step is probably talking to someone who's experienced these things before firsthand. So I'll probably make that a goal of mine, at least within this school semester, within the summer or something, to have that dialogue with someone. So I can really probe into them, because I don't think it'd be fair on behalf of your friend to, ask someone else about them and only, rely on someone else's word. Even though, Teagan, I'm sure you're a fantastic person and you're very truthful and honest, but I think that's only fair on their behalf. So yeah, I thank you for that, though.
Yeah, no problem.
All right, what else you got?
I get the wanting the first person source, and I respect that because stories do change even if you try to be 100% honest and truthful. So my next question was for both you guys. So you guys were talking about a little bit, I think this was, again, mainly Kaylin who said this. I don't remember. But you guys were talking about how there's like biological differences in hormones between like male and female. And then you guys, when you were talking about race, said there wasn't a difference between like white and black and people of color versus white people, etc. And
to clarify real quick, Teagan, that was with regards to intelligence, I believe. I think I was talking in specific to white versus, or Caucasian versus African American origin. In particular, their intelligence, right? If we were to look at, IQ or something. IQ might be a bad test, but keep going. I'm sorry.
No worries. No. My question really is, so you guys made the argument that there isn't a difference in IQ between white and black. But when you were talking about it originally, it made me think you thought because of difference in hormones, there might be a difference in IQ in women and men and their like ability to learn things. Because let's face it, Kaylin, we're both aerospace engineers. I'm sure you've seen it. There are a lot more guys in our classes, in our department, than girls. And that's been like shown in society. Like, oh, girls play with balls. Guys make Legos. I don't know. I think guys play with cars and trains. And I guess like my question to you is, I wanted to have you clarify. Do you think there's a difference in IQ between women and men? And do you think there's a difference between that in terms of the ability to learn, especially in regard to STEM, as that's, I think, where we see the biggest disparity between genders, and like teaching as well is one of those big disparities. That's like more women favored. Yeah, and I think nursing as well is more women favored, and doctors are more favored towards men, just like if you look at ratios. But yeah.
So I'll give my piece first, and then Colin will give his. We might even disagree, or who knows what ends up happening, because we didn't probe into this to the depth that you're probing for. So to elaborate on the point of, in particular, men and women, or the two traditional genders, I don't know if there's actual research proven evidence of differences in intelligence between men and women. I suspect there's not. And if there is, I'd suspect it's marginal or very little. My argument was more towards chemicals in the brain, which I think there's a nuance between that and intelligence. And I think women, I'm no biologist or chemist by any means, but I do understand that there is a difference in the basic chemistry of the human body between men and women. And if we were only to look at those two things in particular, and I believe that has a direct influence on reactions and perceptions of certain environments. And I believe, right, most studies show that there's a correlation. And I actually don't know if these are like politically influenced. As far as I know, they're just studies to try and show statistics. And these statistics are showing that more competitive environments, men are shown to be better in. And I'm not necessarily saying that's a good thing. I think that's just a matter of fact. And women do better in certain other environments. This could be incorrect, but my speculation is like teaching, that's more of an empathetic, caring profession. And you're going to be looking over younger people or people who are aspiring to become things. And that generally requires a very relaxed, empathetic environment. And my perception is that typically women would gravitate towards that more than men. I could be incorrect. I myself want to be a teacher, but that's how I saw it.
And my perception is similar, but not exactly the same, at least how I say it. First, I would be remiss if I didn't acknowledge that this is a generalization, and I'm assuming Kaylin would say the same thing, that every man and every woman are not the same, just using the traditional binaries, first of all. Second of all, if you want to look at differences between men and women in the workplace, starting with salary differences, which are real, that's a real thing, you can't quote the number that doesn't account for job selection, as Kaylin hinted on, because job selection is a real thing. There are plenty of great, liberal, supportive, equal opportunistic Scandinavian countries where equality of outcome is actually less common than in the United States, even though they have more opportunity, right? So that's one example where this may not be the perfect outcome. You may not desire equity. But at the same time, it doesn't mean you can't have it. I would never say that. I don't think there's any IQ differences that I'm aware of. And I think all the science I've seen is old science, similar to that of the scientific racism of the Inquisition of Africa. It strikes me as pretty bunk science. Yeah. But that being said, whatever differences there are, neurophysiologically or otherwise, those do exist on some level if you generalize, on the average. For example, the trait of agreeableness is more common in women generally, and that trait has a negative correlation with the ability to negotiate higher salaries, right? So to your point specifically, I, talking on my own behalf, would say I have no reason to believe that there's an IQ difference across gender, and I would like to think there's none across race. I've seen minor differences in the research, but they're so minor, and I'm not a research scientist that I don't even want to acknowledge them because I don't think it's helpful if they're even real. But to your point about men and women, I don't think there's any difference IQ-wise or in capacity to learn or an ability to do fucking awesome things. And anyone who says otherwise, I think that's just bad science.
Yeah, I want to make sure that my perspective is that I'm a complete advocate for anyone choosing the profession they want. However, I think the current distribution is not because people don't have the choice, and this could be a misconception of mine, but at least how I see is that everyone has these choices, but we just choose to filter into these jobs. And it's because of these generalizations that we're making that hold mostly true, not all the time, of course, that we see this correlation. So
does that answer your question?
Kind of. So are you guys arguing that it's like difference in hormones that makes women more inclined to teaching? Or are you making the argument that it's society that pressures them? Because my argument is it's society and how you were raised. I got lucky. I was raised, I guess you would call it gender neutral, but I liked science. My dad threw science at me. But you can see it, like girls are given dolls, boys are given Legos, and like that whole difference of things. And I saw like my peers when we were younger, everyone was like, woo, math, science, super cool. And then I hit middle school and girls are just like, nope. And I'm wondering, do you guys think it's society, or do you guys think it's like differences in our hormones, which I think do happen because men and women are different, and you can see in like physically we don't look the same. So do you think it's more that, or do you think it's more society?
Well, I want to say before either of us answer, we actually are answering as individuals, although we agree on most things.
Yeah.
And it probably sounds like that. I just want to say that clearly, that we actually might answer differently. But I think that's a great question, and Kaylin, you can feel free to answer.
That's a fantastic question, actually. In fact, I didn't think about the social aspect during the podcast, so I'm glad you brought that up, because that's a facet to the problem that didn't even cross my mind. So do I even think at all society is responsible for that? I think anyone could make the argument, yes. I think it's hard to substantiate that, though. I've met plenty of, I guess, more feminine people that still pursue pretty rigorous career paths. And so I do think that older society, let me put this in a more intelligent way. I think the point society was at in years prior was definitely a contributing factor, especially because part of that was nearly ingrained in legislation and in almost work expectation. And now that that's changing entirely, I don't know how much you can attribute to that. I would still say that there's a little part that society does play in perhaps subconsciously manipulating women to choose something that's less rigorous, right? Because it's seen more attractive, to do, do something more easy or be a housewife or something, right? I think you could argue that's still seen as a more attractive feminine trait in America in modern society. But I think one thing that all of us could look for, unless Colton knows it already, is perhaps research that could correlate how this influences women's decision when pursuing a career path. I think it's much less than it used to be, but I think it might be a little naive of me to deny that might play a little factor in it.
So I somewhat disagree, although it sounds like we're both just going off intuition here, that I think it's both, to your point. Everything I've said so far, I wholeheartedly believe. There are differences biologically. However, I certainly think there are significant remnants of social norms of days past that stick today, whether that's beauty standards or whether that's the stay-at-home mom expectation. Now, granted, that has a caveat. Men can't breastfeed, but at the same time, we have bottles now, right? So there's caveats here, and for us to go into all of them would take up a lot of your time. But I suspect out of the two of us, I lean more heavily in agreement that socialization is a significant factor, but not because simply of the lack of equal opportunity today, but rather the fact that it's a remnant of days past, and we continue to propagate, although hopefully in a diminishing way, these same social norms.
I do think the interesting conversation to have here, and this is obviously this is going to be very controversial, is whether or not a lot of people on the right argue, is that even a bad thing, right? Because one thing to argue here is if you didn't know you had the choice, does it matter, right? A lot of people argue yes. I would probably argue yes. But one thing to consider, we could either go on this or ignore my remarks entirely, but I just kind of want to stick it there as something to float and think about. Bringing up Scandinavia, these kind of norms exist. Maybe not to the point that they do in America, but there are certain things that people naturally gravitate towards, and they've accepted that. And that's kind of ingrained in the subconscious of people, I feel like, right? It kind of dictates their action, whether or not they think about it. And so if people want to change that as an entirety, I think I'm all for that. But, I think the question must be asked, if people are unhappy with that, I think it should change. But are people unhappy about that? Like a decent amount of people. But yeah.
I mean, I think it'd be really great to see 50-50 in engineering, especially. I don't struggle with being like the only girl in a group. I was in a room of 20 people with aerospace engineers for a group project. 2 of us were girls, and that didn't really bug me because I've like kind of accepted that, that's probably going to be how it is. But I think there are steps we can do and like promote more women in STEM and show, hey, women have always been in STEM. It's just their accomplishments haven't been as broadcasted as men's accomplishments were. So, for instance, I didn't know about the work of Katherine Johnson and Mary Jackson, 2 very influential women at NASA, until I saw the movie Hidden Figures in 2016. And Mary Jackson is in my field of aerospace engineering. I had no idea who she was prior to this film. So I think more exposure and more showcasing when women, when people of color, when minorities do something amazing and invent something new, you should show that, because I feel like growing up, we are always shown the accomplishments of white men more so than we were shown like people of color. And when it was people of color, it was like not something like crazy. It was just something like, whoa, like African Americans started going to college. It's like, okay, yeah, but like, we want them to be empowered to do what the white men are doing and make like really cool inventions. In fact, I'm pretty sure the cotton gin was invented by a person of color, but it wasn't widely known, and most people just thought it was a white man. So I think that when these things do happen, we should promote them more, and we should provide more opportunities to them, especially to kids at a young age, showing them there are people that look like you in fields you want to go into. And I think that'll be like a really big deal for future generations, is if we show them good role models, not because of what they look like or their gender or their race, but because they did something awesome. Like, wow, we got a rocket on the moon. Like, we got men on the moon. Amazing. Nobody can refute that. or a new invention was made, like that has made society way easier. Like a woman helped invent the calculator and stuff like that. And that's something we use all the time nowadays. So I really think that could be a path forward to getting more equality and to showing people they have a choice. And I think it is very important to show people all their options so they don't get coerced into something thinking, well, that's my only option. I guess I got to go through this door. Show them they have like they have like a lot of doors to pick from.
Well, you brought up 2 points there, and one of them I absolutely agree with. The idea that people should be exposed to the same ideas as everyone else. They should be exposed to the fact that you have just as much opportunity. You are, in fact, empowered, as you said, to pursue these careers, these goals, this way of life. I agree completely. I actually couldn't agree more. I think you said it very well. The part that I think is more interesting in terms of the fact that we may not agree with it, we may not agree on it, rather, is the idea of equity. Not that it's a bad thing, but should it be required? So, for example, you said 50-50 representation would be good in STEM or in engineering classes. Now, I think ideally that's great. Everyone has equal representation. But at the same time, if we can find that there are biological indicators that lead to a higher propensity of one sex over another going into this field, is it in fact ethically superior to force more people in that wouldn't have picked it anyways because you need representation? I'm not convinced that that's the best option, that this idea that we must have equity because otherwise it would be unfair. I'm not sure that's true, at least across sex norms. Across races, I think there's no real problem there because I'm not convinced there's any interesting biological differences between the races. But across the sexes, I'm not sure that this idea of requiring or expecting equal outcome is necessarily what we want. But I'm certainly open to it. If that were to happen, I have no complaints about it. But I hope I didn't misrepresent what you said in any way.
No, I don't think so. So you're making the argument that race is an arbitrary thing, but you're saying that sex is not, in the way that there are differences, and that you think it would be forcing people to go into STEM that have a predisposition to not, but you think it's fine to like have equal representation towards races. And in regards to sex, I think if that argument was true, we would not see numbers modeling like this of in terms of women going into STEM. So when my dad was in engineering school, I think it was like 2% women, 5% women. My dad was like, whoa, I saw a girl in class today. That is the weirdest thing I've seen. He went to a public school in California, public university, very well known for engineering. And now I'm here at our university, and it's about 30% women in aerospace engineering. Granted, my dad was electrical, so those numbers are a little bit lower. But I think if your argument were to hold true, that there was that women didn't want to go into this field, we wouldn't see numbers like what we're seeing. We wouldn't see more interest in this. We wouldn't see more people wanting to be enrolled. We wouldn't see like clubs like Society of Women Engineers. We wouldn't see this thing called Tech Trek, which is run by the American Association of University Women, who found that girls entering the 8th grade, that is when they stop being interested in science because of society. And they found that by inviting them to this week-long camp at a university and showing them all the cool things science can do, much more of them were more likely to go into STEM, not because they were forced. They applied and they wanted to be there because they had the interest, and they just didn't see people like them, and they thought they wouldn't make it in engineering. And that programs like that are designed to show you, you can make it. And I think given that numbers are going up and are continuing to go up, I think the desire to want to be there is there. I think there are some societal barriers that need to be resolved.
Well, I actually agree with a lot of what you're saying. There are increases in the rates of women in STEM, for example, and I'm all for it. I think a large portion of that was barriers that were largely societal, as I mentioned previously, and now we're just living through those remnants, but they're diminishing, right? So you can see the flip of these rates actually are going up, and I actually agree to that. My point is that if we get to a point where we have no more barriers, right? We have equal opportunity, tried and true, and this may not be anytime soon. I don't know what that'll look like. But if we have that, and then it turns out this peak of growth didn't actually hit 50%. The peak of growth peaked out at 45%. Maybe there's actually the fact that 45% of engineers ended up being women, 55% men, and there was absolute equality of opportunity, however that's measured in the future. Then I'm saying that if we reach that point, I'm not convinced it would be a good thing to require now. Well, everyone is equal opportunity. Let's push it to 50% just because it seems better. But I certainly agree with everything you said, that these are changing trends and they are certainly representative of societal implications of days past. Do you have anything to add to that, Kaylin?
Let me see here. I just want to add that I don't know what I can add. You guys have been having this conversation pretty strongly. I mean, I'll give my 2 cents. I'll try to make it concise. I am completely for whatever people want to do, right? No matter who you are. I mean, unless you're like doing crimes against humanity. I mean, do what you want. I'm a complete proponent of that, and I think for me, it's more of we're just gonna have to wait and see, because ideally, what ends up happening is that no matter what household you're in whatever part of America, you're raised and your subconscious biases do not dictate your path in life. Rather, you have more readily available mental insight to decide those things, right? Because I guess what I'm piecing together from a lot of what you're saying, Teagan, is that a lot of things people are going through and they have no control over, basically, right? Like women are not going to be in aerospace because society is kind of implanting these subconscious seeds in their minds that drive them away from the field or other fields. And so I guess what I'm picturing from this is an ideal future where those subconscious seeds don't exist, and what takes most of the power going forward is your own motivations and no driving factors, which is hard to conceptualize and I think hard to pinpoint because we've never really existed in a time frame where there hasn't been subconscious biases dictating what we do in life. But that's what it sounds like. You can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that's super fascinating. And I'm not sure how I feel about it, but I think if that's where everything ends up eventually, I'm A-okay with that. So
Yeah, I agree with you guys. If we get everything out of the way and there is equal opportunity, to be honest, I have no idea how we'd measure that. And I think to think that that will be achieved is chasing false hope, because I don't think we can eliminate
You're preaching to the choir.
I don't think we're going to eliminate that. So that's why I'm saying I think we will get to 50-50 before that happens, because I think that will never happen. And I don't think you will be forcing them to. I think you will be exposing new generations of you can do whatever you want. And I think that would be a great path forward to try to get it to where it does represent what people want to do instead of what society, quote unquote, tells us to do.
So our real difference here then is maybe a numbers game or semantics. It's that sounds like Kaylin and I actually somewhat agree that our intuition says it might not be 50-50 exactly, but it might. But I don't care if it does. I mean, I would love if everyone is absolutely equal. That's the goal, right? And your intuition says that you think it probably will be 50-50 at some point, if I understood that correctly.
Yeah, I think in my lifetime, it'll be 50-50 or very close. But yeah.
Awesome.
But yeah. And then another thing, to changing topics on you guys here, you guys were talking about how you wanted to be more educated in the LGBTQ community, and you couldn't remember the term, but like a straight guy hooking up with a gay guy was still considered straight. Again, I can't really check that because I'm not sure on your source or what that person was trying to say. But my question to you would be, well, what if you call that person questioning? That's a term in the queer community where you're not sure if you're queer or not. You think you might be, and you're like experimenting, but you might not want to go public with it because, like, well, what happens if you say, like, you come out to everyone as like gay, but then you're like, you just weren't sure about it yet. Like, some people are sure, but some people, aren't sure. So questioning is like an umbrella term that is, you're trying to figure it out and you're still in that process of figuring out who you are and what are the many terms of the LGBTQ community that you identify with, because you could be like a straight, I guess you want to be straight, but like you could be like bi or pansexual. Bi meaning you hook up with girls and guys. Pan meaning you don't care what the heck your lover is. You don't care if they're agender, if they're somewhere on that binary, on that spectrum between male and female. As long as you find them attractive, you want to hook up with them. So that's not an issue. So what do you guys think of the term questioning as an umbrella term for that? And if you did you guys find out anything more about what that term was from the university, or what's up with that? Because I don't totally understand that myself, but that is my pitch to you guys.
I will say the term is shortened to MSM, man seeking man. We both failed to remember what the term was.
Yeah.
So that's our apology, and we should have remembered that, or come more prepared with that. So that's a good point. Thank you for calling us out on that. But that was the term. It was that a man can be hooking up with another man. I believe it was regardless of sexual orientation, actually the other man. But a man hooking up with another man would be considered man seeking man. And my 2 points that I brought up and we discussed, and Kaylin may have other ones, were that one, I actually like the term questioning. Being not sure of yourself. It's like how I mentioned having a third gender could be a practical way to let people feel, like they belong, right? So I actually like the term questioning. And it will probably apply more to younger people, but not necessarily. But I think my first point is that why add another term? Man seeking man. Well, just if it's already under questioning, you don't need to just define another term, because that's more of a practical problem I had with it. And the second and bigger thing we were talking about was this idea of truth. It's the claim that truth acts as a phenomenal framework for which to discover the best solutions to anything. And that applies across society as a whole. And I brought up that if you begin to fudge, if you begin to play with what truth means without any physical, evidential, or substantial basis for that, then that's a dangerous precedent to set. That what does it mean to be gay or be bi or be questioning? If it means I'm bi, that I can hook up with men and women, but then at the same time there's a term that means something like straight, but while I'm having sex with a man, well, you just don't need the term, because you lose this foundation of truth value that we think is so important. And you mentioned that you think is important as well. So really, it's a practical issue. It's that if you don't want to lose the value in the LGBTQ plus or queer community, however you best describe it, if you don't want to lose that value, you can't start invoking a term that doesn't have a basis in reality, especially if it already has synonymous terms that cover what's happening in reality.
Yeah, questioning probably covers the grounds of which most of our concerns with this term arise. The biggest problem was like, okay, man seeking man, you consider yourself straight, but you're having sex with men. We have words for that. That's bisexual or homosexual, right? So like, I guess my thought process was that perhaps people didn't feel comfortable saying homosexual or bisexual. And then I'd ask, okay, well, why are you uncomfortable about that? Well, there were maybe societal pressures that make the people scared to actually commit to the identity. Questioning is a much better term for that, and I think what I just described might fall under someone who would be questioning, maybe someone who's afraid to come out because they're not actually quite sure, and they might fear the repercussions of society's reaction to that. I mean, there's not much I can say there except, honestly, society obviously needs to stop judging people because of their sexual orientation. I mean, that's really the only solution to that. But that comes with a hard battle of trying to understand the people who are homophobic, who are transphobic, who are all of these, things. They're scared of all of these things, I hate to say it, but I think part of the battle needs to become understanding them, because as much as it doesn't seem like it, they are people too. They have experiences, they have all of these biases in their mind. As much as they might have horrible ideas by a modern lens, I think it's important that we walk forward treating both parties equally respectfully, despite the huge gap in understanding that both sides have when looking across the aisle. That's kind of a side tangent, but I think that kind of goes into the whole if people are scared about coming out. But that's a separate thing from if you don't know yourself, right? If you're like, oh, I don't know if I'm or if I'm gay or whatever. I guess that's a separate thing, and I have no experience with that. So,
and real quick to clarify, I assume you mean when you say it, these are people, but it doesn't seem like it. You were talking from the perspective of someone who is homophobic. Or something like that.
I mean, yeah, it was a bold claim, but a lot of people, look, especially on the left, look at people on the right as though they want to completely manslaughter every LGBTQ plus member. It's like, no. I mean, you may have some really extreme right fascist weirdos who are actually questionably sane, but that's a very few amount of people. And I think a lot of the right is misunderstood as people who, just hate people. And although that might be true, unfortunately, I think part of winning them over, convincing them that, of the other side of the story requires what we're having now, which is, okay, what the heck do I need to understand? What do we both need to understand about each other?
Yeah, I'm glad Colton clarified that, because I thought you were saying LGBTQ people, as much as it doesn't seem like that, aren't people. And Colton and I looked at each other like, holy shit, you said that on air.
I like saying extreme things and then hopefully trying to make something out of it.
Yeah, so that was my clarifying point. Kaylin doesn't...
I did say that, yeah, but I meant it as an obviously very extreme and provocative statement. A hyperbole blown to the highest proportions. So, of course, that's not what I believe at all. I believe everyone has their perception on the world, and they need to all be respected, because if we were to find an answer to all these problems, we're going to need to understand the viewpoints at which we can tackle it. And that requires both sides, or all sides if there's more than two. So, yeah.
So my follow-up question, what do you say to people on both sides, extremists that absolutely don't want to listen? Like, they're so stubborn. I've definitely met some people who are diehard Trump supporters, because I think there's a distinction between Trump supporters and Republicans like Mitt Romney, McCain, etc.
Okay,
so people who are diehard Trump supporters, people that we saw on the Capitol on the 6th, how do you propose we get them to listen? And there are people like that on the left. I will admit that there are some people who are completely diehard left. I can't think of the Fox News equivalent for the far left off the top of my head, but people that only believe in something that's so far left, it's complete and utter BS. How do we get those guys to respect each other's views? And how do we get them to be willing to talk? Because I've tried to talk to some Trump supporters, and maybe this is just my experience of talking to one or two Trump supporters in San Francisco, California, where if you say anything remotely conservative, you're going to get some pretty bad looks. But they didn't want to hear anything I had to say on anything about
Right.
that. So what's your take on trying to get them to listen and how to get everybody to just like chill out and listen?
So that is a question that tackles at the core the very purpose of this podcast, I imagine. So that's actually Teagan should be our hidden third member, I guess, because that was a great question. How do we get? Okay, so you're actually posing the problem of the century. How do we get the polar opposite of the aisle to work together? Because I mean, the way I see it right now, it's these two sides on the far ends that kind of pull everyone else away from the middle, because you hear about their crazy antics on the news and you're like, what the hell? Why? You know, it gives people reasons to be mad at each other when they see the antics of the actual very few people that are this far out. The process called polarization. You know, this is I don't want to call it a pipe dream, but I think part of the answer lies in discussion. Now, obviously, your experience has been horrible, and I have little experience with trying to convince very out there people to maybe shift their viewpoints towards a more, maybe less extremist view. That's a great question. Oh my goodness. My mom loves Trump. She would wear all red with MAGA on it if she could, and she's Filipino, right? It's like, what, Mom? Do you understand? Maybe not, but my dad is more centrist. Maybe even, I mean, by definition, he's more left than my mom, and my dad's a almost 50-year-old white guy. So it's like, what the heck? So I'd actually talked to my mom. I haven't done this yet. I've never had a political conversation with my mom because I think I would run into the same roadblocks you have, Teagan, of, is she even going to listen? And if she does, what the heck is going to come out of it if she even gets anything out of it? And she doesn't speak perfect English. So some things are lost in translation in her mind. And so I think a great challenge that I might do and use as perhaps insight for future discussions with this is talk to my mom about politics for once and actually probe into why she's pretty racist. I'm not going to cover it up. She's so, I'm fascinated. I want to learn more about that. I just never asked her because I was like, oh boy, how do I deal with that beast, Because for a lot of people, especially my mom, she's like, that's just the way things are. But to me, that's not a reason behind things. And, people on both sides of the aisle use that. It's, oh, that's just how it is. That, pass me with that shit. That's not a great explanation. If I use that as an explanation for why certain things happened in the physical world, and then I became an engineer, I would hope I get fired on the spot. Oh, it's because that's just the way it is. No, you explain these things, go into the details, run me through everything. That's how we get to understand each other. So yeah, I'll take it upon myself to talk to my mom about that. That's gonna be hard. That's gonna be very hard. I love her to death. She's one of my favorite people in this whole wide world, and I wouldn't be here without her. But her political beliefs they're gonna be something to talk about for sure. So yeah.
And to address your question on a more macro perspective, I foresee two possible solutions to solving this problem of divisiveness, you might call it. Either you censor people, and whoever is in power, so to speak, whoever has the ability to censor, does that. That's one option. Or the other option is to, as Kaylin alluded to very fervently, have conversation. And the former is easier, and the latter requires hope. And I wholeheartedly acknowledge that. It's not easy.
Yeah. If there is like a Da Vinci Code to cracking how to get into the mind and the thinking process of an extremist, that would kind of be the answer to the question, right? And so that might be what I hopefully look for when I try to talk to my mom. I'm already coming up with plans in my head about how to approach the conversation, right? And my first inclination is to approach it from her perspective. Start with, okay, you love Trump and you love all of these things. I want to know why. Why do you think that? And then she can go on her whole spiel about, oh, well, this, and this. And I can say, okay, that's cool. Why do you think that in particular? Right? And before I even take a stance on it, I just want to crack open the shell and see what the heck is the root of all of this. And then once I find that, maybe I could figure something out. But it's going to require a lot of strategizing and a lot of
hoping and praying.
Yeah, a lot of being careful that I don't say something. My mom's like, "Son, what the heck is wrong with you?" You know, that kind of ordeal.
And a lot of empathy too. From my only personal experience I can talk about on this front, you can make headway. There are people out there, podcasters, news hosts, and whatnot. They every now and then will announce that, oh, I've had months worth of emails sent to me or snail mail that say, hey, you've really influenced my life. I used to be, really unthoughtful. Or look at Majid Nawaz. He is a former Muslim extremist, and now he's a moderate Muslim trying to empower different communities. That's awesome, right? So I think there's reasons to have hope. And as Kaylin alluded to in speaking with his mom in the future, I think empathy really is the first step.
Yeah.
Because as soon as you can build trust with someone, which is a slow process, I admit, you have a chance to fill that knowledge size gap in their heart with hopefully better information.
Yeah, and the other thing I want to say here is that what did I want to say? Oh my gosh, I lost it as quickly as I had it. Okay.
What do you think, Teagan?
Yeah, what do you think?
I think I really want people to listen and to be open to discussion, but I've hit some pretty bad roadblocks trying to talk to diehards either way that don't want to listen to reason, and it's like I kind of feel like I'm wasting my time, and then I get riled up because they're spewing I'm going to call this what I call this. People on the right may say it's controversial, but they're being a talking head for Trump, and it's Republican propaganda. And when they start just spewing that instead of telling me facts, and when they can't cite something that's reliable, that really frustrates me. But they are part of our country too. And, I agree, censorship is a way to deal with that. But then you run into the whole problem Facebook, Twitter, all those big tech companies are having. Well, somebody has to watch all that and deal with it and sort it all out. And I do not want that. I wouldn't wish that on my worst enemy. And B, how the hell do we make sure that's not leaning one way or the other? How do we ensure it's equal representation? How do we ensure it's fair? And I don't think there is a way to make censorship fair. And I think maybe something along the lines of the Supreme Court could work, because if we give it to whichever party's in charge, we're just going to keep going from alt-left to alt-right and back and forth and forth and back. As we've seen with Trump pushing through all these executive orders and then Biden being like, all right, that's all gone now. So I think that would be what happened if we gave censorship to the party in charge. So I think discussion is a good way forward, but I'm honestly at a loss for how to deal with people who are so diehard and stuck in their ways and don't want to listen to science. For me, after dealing with them, I don't want to talk to you if you don't believe in science, or if you're blatantly racist, sexist, homophobic. I really don't want anything to do with you, because I've kind of labeled them as lost causes, and that is something I want to try to work on, but it takes a lot of energy for me to
it does. Yeah.
Get them to stop saying those blatant things, and to be just take a breath and listen, and to keep myself from flying off the handle at them, because that really infuriates me. And it's is it worth all that effort and all that commotion that I put myself through to get one person to stop being a diehard right extremist?
that's excellently put, and I think that talks about everything that I think that covers all the facets of the whole topic we're discussing here in regards to perhaps a solution to the polarization that we're seeing. The thing I remembered, or rather the thing that I failed to remember, but I just got back thanks to you giving your piece, was I'm currently in a leadership class at Boulder, and we're currently analyzing big problems, or at least each person individually is analyzing different facets of modern problems. For example, perhaps like race relations in modern America, or some people are doing things about other countries that are definitely problems, things in China, things all over the world. And one of the things that we're trying to look at is how do we actually do something about it, instead of just saying that we're doing something about it and then thinking we did a good job because we said we were doing something about it, right? And I think we can preach discussion all day, but I think there needs to be a point where we need to start seeing results from discussion on a mass scale. And so I think the starting point needs to be how are we going to figure out to get people into the dialogue in the first place? And clearly that's what the podcast is for. So hopefully the podcast blows up. But then, how do people actually listen and then make change off that? Because my class has taught me that people will listen and people will know what the right answer is, but they will still choose to do the wrong thing a lot of the time, right? So I think part of this, mystical problem is figuring out, in general, how to get people to actually commit to the things that they know is right, rather than saying, okay, I'm aware this is an issue, but I'm still going to be racist anyways, right? Because I think that's going to turn out to be a surprising amount of people. They're aware of how it impacts people, but they choose to do it anyways. So that'll be something I'm going to keep in mind moving forward. I'm probably going to do race relations as my big project for the class. And so hopefully a lot of the research I do and a lot of the people I talk to will give me insight. So that way, if we do like a take 3, or you're ever a guest again and the topic is brought up about, extremism and people having views about people, like, hopefully I can say something intelligent about that. So I'm looking forward to that. As of right now, though, I think all three of us are in the same boat of let's talk it out and hope.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree.
So.
And my final question for you guys is, you guys were talking about like groups and how I really heard this from Caleb. I'm sorry, I feel like I'm like coming at you this whole podcast, but
no, me and Colin re-listened to it and we're like, wow, I said some crazy stuff. So go ahead. I wasn't trying to hold back in the podcast episode, so don't hold back here, Teagan. What you got?
So you were very in favor of like individualism and don't be a sheep. And you were talking about how, is it like harmful to be a part of the, like, you use the LGBTQ group, and you were saying, well, like, why would you want to do something about sexuality, which is so personal? And my perspective on it is, in today's day and age, it's helpful because it acts as like a support group for problems that they faced. I have personal experience because I was in the theater department in high school, which has been like a huge supporter of the LGBTQ movement. I was in the Genders and Sexualities Alliance Club at my high school. Again, it's probably really possible because I live in San Francisco, California. But so we had like National Coming Out Day where people would like we took a prop door, you would open it, step out, announce your name and your sexuality, and like you got a bunch of support from school. This was at our lunch period in our main quad. But for people, this is me making a generalization, but I guess for people that don't live in such an accepting community, I think having that group of people online, in person, wherever you find it, is a way for you to be yourself and have that like safe space. So I guess like as of right now, what do you think of like LGBTQ being a group for that like safe space? Because up until actually June of 2020, you could be fired for being gay LGBTQ plus in half the states in the United States.
I did not
This
know
is
that.
a recent case. So California, luckily, was not passed this law a long time ago. And a couple of my teachers who were openly gay always told us how thankful they were to be teaching in California because they could be gay and open and talk to us about it without fear of my principal being like, you're gay, you're fired, because that's illegal in California. And it took until, last summer to get the Supreme Court to say, nope, that goes against the Civil Rights Act, that goes against, you can't fire somebody for that. That'd be like equivalent to firing someone because they're black or because they're a girl. Like, that's not okay anymore. So as of right now, given that they are still oppressed and still face legal barriers, what do you think of them, the group as a support group and trying to advance their equal rights?
So I will actually agree with you tenfold and clarify the point I was trying to make. I think it's actually very good to have a group like that, especially when there's still lingering issues in America regarding how that group of people is treated. And it sounds to me, especially with what you just said, that even until just recently, that it's been pretty garbage. So my whole point was that once this is all said and done and we're all equal, I had trouble understanding why people would use that as a means to stick together when there is so much more to a person. In my opinion, this is also a bold thing. I think to claim that there's more to a person than that, and that there's other reasons to be cohesive other than who you're interested in a sexual partner. But as it stands in modern day, I think it's justifiable entirely. I may not have made that clear enough. I think I said somewhere in the podcast that I believe we're in like a transitionary period. Hopefully we're in a transitionary period. Hopefully we're not in something that's just completely in limbo forever. But hopefully in a couple of decades from now, I would think that we wouldn't have to worry about it as a problem. Maybe I'm saying something that makes no sense here, but I was just struggling to see how a group like that would hold together once all of this is done. And that could be in the next few years, depending on how fast change occurs, and how much the current politicians and people in office actually care about their constituents, because that's yet to be seen. So I guess that's all I said. Hopefully I didn't make it sound like I didn't see why they existed today. I may have made it sound that way, but I totally see why they still exist today as a group. Yeah, obviously, in a democracy, numbers are power. And so having a voice that's more powerful requires more people. And so you would need a group to hold people together so that way a common interest could be conveyed to policymakers. Yeah, I guess, did I clarify that enough for you, Teagan?
Yeah, it came across as you didn't see why it was today, and I was like,
okay,
dude, there's a big problem here. Yeah,
Well,
especially. Go ahead.
I will say one thing too that I brought up, and I think we both talked about it, that gets meshed into that, is the idea of one policy politics,
Oh, yes,
right? One policy politics, and how that's a similar line of thinking to the identity politics you see today that we both are not fans of. And so to another point that may have gotten mixed in with what you heard Kaylin say, is that we both, it sounds like, don't particularly love the idea that once one facet of you is known, let's just say one facet being that you are a homosexual man, right? Oh, you're homosexual. That then determines the rest of your identity. And not everyone thinks that's the case, but it seems to be a trend that on any side. Oh, you're gay, therefore, here's some examples I gave. You have a high-pitched voice, or you have to wear around rainbow flags, or you have to be feminine. I mean, I did a little side hustle once, just, pulling weeds and stuff online to make a few extra dollars. And I didn't know the guy I was working for was gay because we didn't talk about it until, quite a while into our working together, because he didn't have all of the general stereotypical characteristics, right? He was just a guy, and there's nothing wrong. Just a guy could mean high pitch, low pitch. It doesn't actually matter. But that's the point, right? Is that it doesn't have to define you. So that's another point that I brought up, that I just didn't like that a group, whether it's the queer community, whether it's the NRA, it doesn't actually matter. Oh, I'm a Christian, therefore I support guns, but I also support babies. It's like, well, maybe you don't support guns. It doesn't have to define your entire being. So that's a point I wanted to clarify, and I wouldn't be surprised if that also got meshed in with the point Kaylin made as well.
Yeah, and to clarify even further, or rather not clarify even further, but to add on to Colton's point, I don't know. I honestly don't know. I imagine more left-leaning stereotypes are associated with the LGBTQ plus community. But like Colin just said, I would hope people don't use that as reason to infer hundreds of other things about people. I mean, that leads into the whole final discussion of the last episode, which is, the stereotypical don't judge a book by its cover discussion. So, yeah. I think that may have been one of the other things I was worried about when I was talking about the community, was like, well, people they're not being seen at their true value. That necessarily might not be the fault of the community that they're in, rather a fault of the outsiders looking at the community for judging the community based on one example. This applies to everyone in every community that's ever existed, I feel like people need to stop doing that. I've met so many people that are always exceptions to everything that you think about once you learn more about them, It's like, oh, I thought your type of people was like this. It's like, no. It's like, oh, okay, well then that was me being an idiot, I mean, let's be honest here. If I was inferring that about hundreds of thousands of people, clearly I wasn't making the correlation in my mind that every person I've met up until this point's been different. Why would I assume 100,000 would be the same? So, or millions, Yeah, hopefully that clarified my point. I looking back on it, I do realize I probably sounded very against the community. I was more so against the idea of people grouping together based on merely one facet of a very colorful life, in my opinion. Of course, there's no other way to group people than by simple things about them. But that was just a whole argument for individualism in the far future. With regards to now, I totally see why they exist and why it's important.
Yeah. I think like a counterpoint about like grouping is, I think, finding people who have similar interests in you as you is like a good thing, provided you question authority and that you work together to like talk about things, and that isn't like your one focus, but rather you're just choosing to highlight that part of your identity with people. So when I'm with engineers, I definitely bring up the more like nerdier side of me, but when I'm with like people in my poli-sci classes, I bring out the more argumentative side of me, because that's gonna fit better there than in engineering.
Yeah.
And I think groups are good to like give you people to like hang out with, because I'm a very people person. I love being in different groups of people and like talking all the time, because we've been talking for however long this has been going on. But I think by having those conversations and talking about things that aren't related to that can show you more about a person. And like you said, there always are exceptions to every rule. And I think if you actively work to break down those perceptions, then that will allow us to have like groups that are good. So I'm an engineer in a sorority, which I think are pretty polar opposites for college. So all my sorority friends are like, an engineer with a personality. Holy crap. And all my engineering friends are like, so do you just go out and get drunk and shit-faced every weekend? And I'm like, you're both wrong. Like, no, guys. You just gotta chill. Like, yeah, a lot of engineers are nerdy and quiet, and I definitely stick out. And yeah, a lot of people in the sorority do party. Like, it's a sorority. We're there to, like, have fun and meet new people. But I think you're, like, missing the whole point of, I'm an engineer because I love STEM, and I joined a sorority to meet a bunch of cool people that aren't engineers because I wanted a new perspective from them. So I think groups can work, but I think that there needs to be a sense of individualism. But I wouldn't want to live in a world where there aren't any groups.
Interesting. Okay. The middle ground. Nice.
Well, Teagan, thank you for sitting down with us. This was an awesome conversation. And even if it were not to be published, we would have done this anyways, just because we wanted to hear different opinions, because we knew there'd be a little bit of dissent here and there. We could pick each other's brain and hopefully learn. Because as we addressed, if we're not going to go the censorship route, then hopeful dialogue is really the only foreseeable option. And this conversation is an exemplary form of that. So again, thank you for sitting down with us, and we hope to have more conversations in the future.
Yeah, sounds good. Thanks for having me, guys. It's been really fun.